All right, thanks, Adam. And yeah, thanks for having me along and thanks for joining everyone else. It's great to be here and yeah, have a chance to chat about shark depredation. It's a pretty topical issue in Queensland and across a lot of Northern Australia. So yeah, just going to run through some of the work we've been doing over the last 10 years or so and a few of the sort of projects we've got going on at the moment. So Adam and I have been doing a project at Cocos Keeling Islands that I'll talk about, as well as some other stuff going on in Queensland. So I'm a fisheries biologist working for Queensland DPI. I've been there since about 2019. Before that, I was in Western Australia doing my PhD on shark depredation. So just to start off with, just acknowledging traditional owners and custodians of the land and water on which we work and meet, and paying my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So to kick off, most of you probably already know some of this, but just to give you a rundown on what shark depredation actually is and why it happens. So it's where a shark will remove fish off fishing gear. So obviously that can be line fishing or net fishing, but most of what we're going to be talking about today is centered around line fishing. And it's happening widely across Northern Australia, as I mentioned, so WA, NT, Queensland, and New South Wales as well. And in terms of the sharks, it's a pretty energy efficient feeding strategy for them compared to sort of chasing down a fish and preying on it naturally. And there's a range of sensory cues they use to actually do this. So obviously they cue in on the noise of a boat engine, fish oil and blood in the water, and movements of hooked fish when they're struggling on the line. Also, the sharks learn to take advantage of new food sources. So, for example, they associate the boat engine noise with this source of food. And I just put up this figure on the right here, which is from an experiment we did in the Ningaloo Marine Park, where we basically went back to the same site 6 days in a row and dumped some bait in the water and timed how long it took the sharks to arrive. And the graph shows that basically across the 6 days, the sharks were arriving faster and faster each day, up until the last day where they were arriving within about 2 minutes of the boat arriving. So that's a really clear indicator that they can show this learned behavior. But there's a range of other things at play here as well. So, there's potentially been changes in shark distribution and abundance. People are seeing a lot more sharks when they're on the water. And changes in fishing patterns as well. So, reduction in certain types of commercial fishing like trawling. When, in the past, the sharks would feed on a lot of the discards from trawlers. There's a lot less of that happening now. But at the same time, there's been probably an increase in recreational fishing as well. So why is it important? Well, as some of you know, it's obviously causing a big loss of target fish, which is sort of an extra level of mortality, because generally when people go out to get their quota, in terms of commercial fishers or their bag limit for recreational fishers, they want to get to that amount. And if they're losing fish along the way, then that's an extra mortality on top. And then there's the economic impacts from actually losing the fish and fishing gear as well. And a lot of people are traveling a lot further to try and get away from the sharks, which is obviously costing them in terms of fuel. But on a social level as well, it's really, reducing the quality of the fishing experience for a lot of people. It's having an impact on charter fishing tourism. And in terms of the sharks, often they get hooked in the process of taking hooked fish. So there's that bycatch issue. And, sometimes people retaliating against the sharks as well, which on a bigger scale is sort of reducing the sort of having negative impact on the whole shark conservation perspective as well. So just to sort of give you a rundown of some of the work we've done to date, up until about the year 2000, there'd been very little research on shark depredation. So you can see on that graph on the right there, that's the number of studies per decade. So very little done up until about 2000, and then it's really taken off. So this is from a global lit review we did in 2018 to really look at all the work that had been done. And we found that the vast majority of that work had been done in large-scale tuna fisheries. And some of those studies had recorded the rate of depredation, so that's the percentage of catch lost. And that was quite widely variable, from some studies where it was close to 0 all the way up to 26%. And interestingly, across all of those studies, up to 27 different shark species recorded as responsible. So that's, it's not just the behavior that's shown by one kind of rogue species. This is a very widespread and opportunistic form of behavior that sharks learn. And generally across all of those studies, the Indian Ocean came out as the area where depredation was highest. And I just put those images in the bottom there just to point out that it's not just sharks that do this behavior. We also get large fish like cod and barracuda trying to take fish off the hooks, and also a range of cetacean species like killer whales in some of the longline fisheries as well. So really the first work that was done on depredation happened in WA. So we wanted to go out and actually quantify how many fish were being lost in recreational fisheries in the Ningaloo Marine Park. So the map on the right there is from a boat ramp survey we did, talking to over 400 fishers to get information about the trip that they'd just come back from and how many fish they lost to sharks. So from the color scale there, you can see that most of the fishing trips, the depredation rate was between 0 and 25%. But there is a bit of a cluster. I'll just try and point this out. There's a cluster just here where you've got a lot of trips where it's much higher, so between 25 and even some trips, 100% of the catch being lost. So that was really the first work to actually quantify the impact of this depredation. And overall, across all those 400 trips, we found that about 40% of trips suffered depredation, and the average catch loss was 12%. And that's, as I said, just an average that doesn't really reflect. Obviously, on some trips, it can be really high, up to 100%, whereas others, it might be 0. So from a sort of stock assessment point of view, we need to understand what the average is across the broader range of fishing. And then in this other graph at the bottom here is from some work we did in the commercial Spanish mackerel fishery in WA, where we looked at the depredation rate in each of the 3 main regions. And the depredation rate was slightly lower than that recreational study, between 1 and 5%, but we did see some changes, well, increases over time. And moving on to Queensland more recently, we've been running a project specifically looking at Spanish mackerel and the depredation that's happening in that fishery. So we've collected data from over 100 fishing trips now, so both commercial and recreational trips. And the depredation rate in the commercial trips was very similar to what we found in WA. However, the recreational trips were a lot higher, around 36% depredation. So that's quite interesting in itself, and that probably reflects a range of things. So firstly, fishing experience levels of recreational versus commercial fishers, and quite importantly, the gear being used as well. So the commercial fishers use very heavy gear. They use often winches and electric reels to get the mackerel in really fast, so that gives them a chance to avoid the sharks, whereas some of the more standard gear the recreational fishers are using, that fight time is longer and gives the sharks more of an opportunity to take the fish. But importantly, the data from that project has just been incorporated into the new 2025 stock assessment for Spanish mackerel, which some of you might have seen. And that's a really good case study because it shows the value of having that empirical data to actually better assess the overall fishing mortality. Because in most of our fisheries, we basically don't have any data on shark depredation. So we're really pushing hard to collect that in the next few years. And then interestingly, this graph on the right here just shows the depredation rate by month. So we found noticeably lower depredation in winter months. And that's mainly linked to just the water temperature and the activity levels of the sharks, as well as potentially the distribution of their natural prey. And another thing just to point out, we did some satellite tagging of Spanish mackerel with some game fishers. And that was the main goal of that was to actually look at the mortality rates of released fish. So that's another side to this. Sharks are taking fish off the hooks, but they're also preying on the mackerel after they're released. And we found that about 33% of all the fish we released were being taken. So that's another form of fishing mortality that we could incorporate into that stock assessment. On a broader scale, we've been collecting depredation data in our boat ramp survey now for 2 years, and that's giving us some really good insights into the occurrence of depredation. So this graph shows the main regions in Queensland and the proportion of catch that's being taken by sharks on trips where depredation occurs. So that's pretty much between about 30 and 50% of the catch on a given day. So it's quite a substantial impact. And actually, you can see that Townsville on there has some of the highest rates. So that's really valuable data, again, that we can use in our stock assessments. And for those of you who fish recreationally a lot, we have now incorporated a field into our recreational fishing app where you can actually submit your depredation data on a given fishing trip. And that app also has a fishing diary function now, so you can actually go back and look at all your fishing trips through time and see what your catch was, what the environmental conditions were, that kind of thing. So it's a really valuable resource for recreational fishers. And then in the commercial sector, we've been working to try and get some better data collection using the e-logbook system. So we want to make sure that we're getting consistent data on depredation for the trips where it does happen, but also where it doesn't happen, because we need to get those zero data as well. So the e-logbook gives us a good method to collect data in a more robust way. And I just put this one in here. So this is a paper that I worked on with Adam and Al in a spearfishing competition in the GBR. So this was a few years ago now, and we wanted to actually look at catch rate, shark sightings, and depredation across the whole sort of spatial area where the competition happened over 2 days. And interestingly, you can see this zone just here where depredation was a lot higher. Most of the other zones, it was pretty low, but yeah, notably higher on that reef. And we found that when you average everything out across the whole competition, it was about a 6% depredation rate, with the main species being grey reef, bull, white tip, and great hammerhead. But spearfishing, obviously that's kind of a different form of depredation. It's also bringing into perspective the safety risks. So trying to come up with a range of measures to improve safety, such as always diving in pairs or groups, getting the speared fish out of the water as soon as possible, and just being knowledgeable about the behavior of the sharks and getting out of the water if you're in doubt. And then another important aspect is to actually identify the shark species, as I touched on in the last slide. So based on the work we've been doing over the last 10 years now, we found at least 15 different species doing this behavior. So the work we did in WA, we used fishing cameras on the lines to identify shark species, and just some examples of that in those images there. And there's a couple of studies that have developed a genetic technique to actually identify the species as well. So that's basically where you take a swab from a half-bitten fish and you can identify the shark based on the DNA, the residual DNA left on the fish, which is a very clever technique. And that's helped us to identify some of the main species in Queensland, like bull sharks, grey reef, sandbar, and blacktip. But again, we've also found that some of these larger fish species can also be responsible for depredation in about 10 to 15% of the cases. And then another form of recent research has been testing mitigation methods. So there's a few different electrical deterrent products out there that have been developed specifically for depredation. One of those is the Ocean Guardian Fish 01. And there's a diagram of that at the top right here. So basically it has a power module that sits just below the surface. And then there's a long cable about 6 to 8 meters below the boat. And the idea is that as you're reeling a fish up to the boat, they come within that electrical field and they're protected. So Jaden Varden was testing this with a charter fishing operator out of Port Douglas and found pretty promising results. So reducing depredation from about 46% to 16%. However, there were some, practicality issues with using it, especially when there were strong currents and a lot of people fishing on the boat. You can get line tangles. So there's a bit more work to be done there in terms of improving the deployment of that product. And then in WA, they also tested that same device along with a magnetic deterrent and an acoustic deterrent. And there's just a bit of a graph here at the bottom showing the depredation rate with each of those devices, as well as a control with no deterrent. So that black line is the control, which you can see had the highest depredation rate. And then each of the deterrents, the depredation rate was lower. And for the Ocean Guardian, that had the strongest effect. So, these products do show some potential. They're not going to work 100% of the time, but it's something that we can test and then sort of gradually improve by working with fishers on the water. We've had a project also running at Lord Howe Island since 2018. And this is quite an interesting system because it's only really one shark species involved. It's the Galapagos sharks, and they're super abundant at Lord Howe. So there's a lot of issues with not just depredation, but the fishers hooking up the sharks so frequently they can't even catch their target species. So there's those two angles to it. But also there's a couple of ecotourism companies on the island who actually take people out to see sharks for like snorkeling and diving trips. So they sort of have this positive investment in the sharks. So we're trying to make sure we can come up with some ways to actually balance, the negative impacts that the sharks are having on the fishing, but also, maintaining the positive benefits they bring to businesses as well. So one aspect we've been looking at is actually tracking the shark movements around the marine park and identifying their residency patterns and their home ranges. And then we've overlapped this with data that we've got from the fishing vessels, from satellite tracking, so we can identify areas where there's really high overlaps of the shark movements and the fishing vessel activity. So this map here, these sort of red ovals just show some of these hotspot areas we've identified. So this is information we put together working with New South Wales DPI into a leaflet for fishers so that they can be aware of these hotspot areas and try and avoid them as much as possible. And on top of that, we've come up with this set of guidelines that we've been working closely with the fishers on. So it's some practical tips to try and reduce depredation, and this is beneficial for new tourists coming to the island who haven't experienced this depredation issue before. So things like fishing shallower than 30 meters or deeper than 100 meters to avoid the main depth range of the Galapagos sharks, using electric reels, rotating fishing areas regularly so you're not always going back to the same spot. And the island has introduced a fish waste composting system to allow people to bring their fish waste back to land rather than continuing to dump it at sea, and reinforcing that behavior change in the sharks. So that's sort of a good example of education and communication and how that can benefit as well. And more recently, we've been doing testing of another shark deterrent product called Fish Tech, which has shown, again, pretty promising results, so over 50% reduction in sharks taking the bait. And I've got a bit of a video here. So this is what the deterrent looks like. It sits on your line about 30 centimeters above the hook. And this is from some testing we did with a sort of experimental setup and a sort of downward looking camera. So we've got a bait bag here with the deterrent next to it. And you'll just see the reactions of the sharks as they're coming in. Hang on. As they're coming in to take the bait. See these strong reactions of the sharks when they turn away from the bait. I'll just play that again. Sorry, just having some issues with it. Well, I'll just move on to the next one anyway. But yeah, basically what we saw was the sharks, they'll come in and repeatedly try and get to the bait, but when they enter that electrical field, which is about 1 to 2 meters in diameter, they have these really strong behavioral reactions. You can see their eyes twitching and their gills sort of pulsing. They're really sensitive to that electrical field, so it's quite effective at deterring them from taking the bait. And then following on from that, as I mentioned, some work I've been doing with Adam and others at Kirkus Keeling Islands. It's another system where they're getting really high depredation. It's different species, so we have grey reef sharks taking fish in the deep water, and then black-tip reef sharks inside the lagoon. And it's affecting both the local subsistence fishery and also fly fishing. You can see that guy in the bottom there with a half-eaten bonefish looking pretty disappointed. So one thing we looked at in terms of a technological solution here was another deterrent called Repellex. So there's a diagram of that here. It's quite different to the other product. It's a lot longer, so it has a battery module at the top and then an electrode at the bottom, and it creates an electrical field between those two parts, and it's about 2 meters in diameter. So that's clipped on about 50 centimeters above your hook, and the idea is that as the fish is being reeled up to the boat, that sort of hooked fish would be right in the middle of those two electrodes and protected by the electrical field. And I'll show you a video of that in just a sec. But yeah, we found it was pretty highly effective, reducing depredation by about 76%. So that was a really promising result, and we're working closely with the community to get more uptake of that device. And then on the fly fishing side of things, it's quite different. Like, this device isn't going to be suitable for fly fishing because it's, quite bulky. So we've been looking at other techniques, so coming up with a similar list of best practice guidelines for new fly fishers to follow. And also, part of the issue at Cocos is actually predation of the bonefish once they're released. So we've been testing some recovery cages where you put the fish in for about 1 to 2 hours to let them recover their strength before releasing them. And that's sort of only at a very early stage so far, but seems to be providing some benefit in terms of their survival. So this video is from some deep water fishing we were doing with the Repellex deterrent, and you're basically going to see a group of grey reef sharks chasing up a hooked fish and trying to get to it. Play. So you're seeing they're trying hard to get to the fish, but they can't quite push through that electrical field. It allows them to get the fish up safely. So that was, quite an effective device that we used mainly for deep water fishing at Cocos, and we're looking to do some further testing of that in other places, including Queensland. But then the next thing I was just going to run through is some research we're doing currently on a national scale, which is funded by FRDC. So essentially, back in 2022, FRDC ran a workshop scoping out the scale of the depredation issue and the impact it's having across all of the states. And leading on from that, we've now set up this national mitigation project, which is running until the end of next year. And it's a collaboration between all the main states where depredation is happening. And there are 3 phases to this work. So firstly, a global literature review, where we're actually going out and looking at all the mitigation methods tested around the world. And then we've run a series of stakeholder workshops back in March across the 4 main states. And right at the moment now, we're running a national online survey, which I'll talk about a bit later, to try and get data from a broader range of fishes as possible. And the ultimate goal of this work is to really bring together all that information to develop a set of mitigation methods that we can then go out and test with fishes on the water. So the first phase was really to try and get an understanding of what had already been done in terms of mitigation. And we wanted to keep this as broad as possible. So looking at depredation, but also any methods that have been tested to reduce bycatch or the risk of bites on humans, because there's also some overlap, particularly for the shark deterrents in that space. We had a team of 7 fisheries experts who went through and ranked all of the methods we identified using 7 criteria. So they're just at the bottom here. So effectiveness at reducing depredation, the suitability across different fishing sectors, the cost of the method, and then we had 4 impact criteria. So whether it affects catch rate of target species, the sharks, and then also non-target species in the environment. And we basically used this approach to generate a short list of the top 5 ranked methods across all of the studies. So just to give you a quick rundown of the results, throughout this work, we found there were 90 different methods tested around the world, and they went back all the way to 1968. There's a map of this here. I don't know how well you can see the colored dots, but that's essentially just showing the spread of where all of this testing has taken place. There's been a fair bit in Australia. There's been a lot in the US and some in the Southern Ocean as well. And the goal of that was really to look at, which methods have been effective in other studies and try and see whether they can be effective in Australia. Basically, in dividing up all of these 90 methods, they fit into 4 main categories. So changes to fishing gear, that's things like using electric reels, modifications to fishing methods, so that could be something like fishing in deeper water, fisheries management measures, so an example of that would be increasing the commercial take of sharks, and then lastly shark deterrents, which I've already talked about a bit. But the final short list of methods that we came out with were that Repellex deterrent, which, as I've shown you, was pretty effective in studies so far. Electropositive metals and magnets, so they're like another form of deterrent, which can have an impact on shark behavior. Faster retrieval using electric reels. There's a lot of fishers out there already using electric reels with some success. The fish tech deterrent that I showed you at Lord Howe, and then using education campaigns was another approach. So this is the 5 main methods here, and they all, they all have their pros and cons. None of them are going to be a silver bullet to solving the depredation issue. You're always going to get some level of depredation. But at this stage, we see a benchmark of reducing depredation by 50% as a good goal to aim towards. And again, each of these products or methods have their place. They're not going to be suitable for certain types of fishing. The Repellex is mainly for deep water fishing. Electric reels and winches are more of a thing that commercial fishers use, although interestingly at the workshops we have seen a lot of uptake by recreational fishers as well. And then education's in there because that's a really powerful tool to provide fishers with some best practice guidelines to reduce depredation in a practical and cost-effective way. So we see there's a lot of value in that approach. But basically, now that we've identified these methods, we took those on to the next phase, which was the stakeholder workshops, because we wanted to get some feedback from the fishers about, how suitable these methods are going to be and how do we go about testing them. So we ran 10 workshops across Queensland, WA, NT, and New South Wales, with close to 130 fishers from different sectors, as well as, peak bodies and tackle shops. And each workshop had 5 sessions. So first of all, we gave the fishers a chance to share their experiences with depredation. Then we talked about the current status and management of shark fisheries, because that's obviously a big one that often comes up in conversation. We ran through some of the research that's been done. And then we had a session to actually give the fishers a chance to rank each of the mitigation methods that I've just run you through using the same criteria. And then we did a participatory mapping exercise as well to look at all the different factors which are driving depredation. So I've just included in here some of the main insights we got from the workshops in terms of what fishers are experiencing on the water. So how frequently does depredation occur? Well, pretty unanimously, fishers were saying it occurs on the vast majority of trips, and it's common to lose, 50% of your catch, especially for species like Spanish mackerel. And interestingly as well, it seems to be an issue that's creeping further south on both the west and east coasts. We know that from recent research, bull sharks are spending longer down in New South Wales with climate change, and there's been sort of shifts of prey species as well. So we're really trying to sort of keep ahead of this issue and see how it might change over time. So it was good to get those insights. And then another important thing was to try and capture how it's been changing over time. So generally, the consensus was that depredation has increased over the last 10 to 15 years. Although in some places, as I said, New South Wales, it's more of a recent issue. So good to document that. In terms of what's actually causing depredation, fishers had some really good insights. So one of the main sort of theories is that in most of the states, there's been a big reduction in commercial shark fishing, and that's led to a recovery of some of those populations and therefore more interactions with sharks. In Queensland, especially, bull sharks were the species that's being encountered most frequently. But then on the flip side, there's also been a lot of changes in the dynamics of fishing activity. So as I've touched on earlier, increase in recreational activity and a decrease in some of the commercial fisheries, but also technology as well. So things like GPS, sounders, and electric motors are really powerful tools that give fishers the opportunity to pinpoint a specific fishing location and keep going back there whenever they want. And that's more than likely exacerbated this behavioral change in sharks, where they know they're going to get an easy feed at certain locations. And then some environmental changes as well. So quite a few fishers noticed over the last few decades, there's been a big reduction in bait fish. Less natural prey around for sharks might have led to them targeting fishing boats more often. So there's this whole range of factors that's feeding into this issue. And then fishers have been trying to manage this by making alterations to their fishing methods. So 2 of the main ones were people just traveling a lot further offshore to get away from firstly sharks, but also other people fishing, and then also fishing deeper as well. And then for game fishers in particular, they've changed their practices quite a lot in places like Broome and Exmouth in WA. They used to sort of fish very light gear to target records, but now they just can't do that because it takes too long to get the fish in, and therefore they'll lose them to sharks. So they've switched to using much heavier gear. Then we wanted to document some of the costs as well. So for commercial fishers, the loss on a single trip can be huge. So just for example, a Spanish mackerel fisher losing 20 fish in a day, that would be $4,000. Loss of fishing gear is also a huge impact for both commercial and recreational. And as I said, extra fuel adds up as well. The charter sector is being particularly badly impacted because they're losing a lot of bookings. People might go up to a place like Exmouth, have a pretty average week of fishing due to the shark depredation, and then not want to come back. So that's really having a knock-on impact on those businesses, but also all the other tourism businesses associated with that, like the accommodation, the bakeries, things like that. And, social impact as well, just reducing people's enjoyment of fishing and affecting fishing clubs, particularly for game fishing. So another important thing that we wanted to discuss at these workshops was the current context around shark fisheries management, because we often get asked about this. What are the populations of sharks? What's the commercial landings, and how has that changed? So interestingly, the trend in commercial landings across Queensland, WA, and NT is very similar. So on the right here, we've just got the landings for Queensland at the top and NT at the bottom. You can see they both pretty much peaked around 2005, and then there was this quite substantial decline up until the present. And that's really being driven by a few different things. So firstly, market factors. There's been a decline in the demand for meat and fins, both domestically and globally. So there's just that red line on the plot there is the price of fins internationally. So the fishers are getting a lot less money for their fins as they used to. And also there's been quite a substantial increase in regulations around shark fishing, things like having to have fins naturally attached, phasing out certain types of fishing gear like gill nets. So that's also had a knock-on impact on the landings. And then more broadly, there's been this just general societal change in the perception of sharks. A lot of people just don't want to eat shark anymore. And some of the species that we have in Queensland, the meat isn't sort of as desirable as things like gummy shark from the southern fisheries. So, the fishers aren't getting such a good price as they used to. And another limiting factor is we really have quite limited data on shark populations. We don't really have stock assessments for most of the species. WA is a bit of an exception. They've just completed a quite comprehensive stock assessment, but certainly Queensland and NT were very lacking in data, so we need to look into new approaches to assess those populations, whether it's using genetics or other methods. But overall, the idea that a lot of people talk about is, trying to rapidly increase shark fisheries again to, take more sharks out of the system and reduce depredation. But that whole approach is limited by a range of factors, whether it's market demand, social license, and also coming up with the fishing gears that are going to be effective at catching sharks in a targeted way without catching bycatch species. So there's a number of challenges to that, but I know that, the state fisheries management agencies are looking at ways to try and improve the marketability of sharks and sort of reinvigorate those fisheries to some extent. And then we wanted to get some information from the workshops about mitigation methods that fishers are using. So moving location and fishing more remote areas is a big one. A lot of fishers are investing in electric reels. Some fishers have been experimenting with other deterrents like shark bands, which is that one in the bottom there. It's a magnetic deterrent. And then just changing their practices, so putting less fish waste in the water, and in some cases, catching sharks in high depredation areas. And then lastly, we wanted the fishers to actually have a chance to rank each of the main methods that we identified in the literature review. So we ran through an exercise where we put up these big sheets of paper on the wall and gave the fishers an opportunity to rank each of the methods on a 1 to 5 scale for each of those 7 criteria. And that gave us some really nice data on their perceptions around these mitigation methods and which would be likely to be most suitable. So the table on the right here is basically where we've aggregated all of the scores across the 10 workshops we did to create averages, and the cells in green are essentially the methods that were ranked most highly at each of the individual workshops and then overall. So the sort of broad consensus was that the fish tech deterrent was ranked quite highly by fishers because it's, you know, a small practical device to fit on your line and it's relatively cheap. Faster retrieval also came out ranked highly in a few of the workshops because that's something that fishers can relate to. You know, they're already using electric reels. And then education was also another one that came out ranked highly because, you know, there's a lot of value in communicating best practice guidelines like we talked about earlier. So that's all feeding into this ultimate goal of this project to really come out with this robust list of 3 to 5 of the most promising methods to then go out and test in the next phase of the work. And I just put this one up here. So just yesterday, we released our online survey. So the goal of this is to really collect information from a broader range of fishers as possible across the whole of Australia. We've also included Victoria, Tasmania, and South Australia in this, just to get some baseline data on, you know, whether depredation is occurring in those states. We think it's going to be relatively low, but again, good to get a handle on that early on before it might change over time. So there's a QR code just here. If you want to have a go at the survey, you can scan that, and the survey will be open for a month. It takes about 10 minutes to complete, and it's, you know, totally anonymous. We're just asking you questions about your fishing and about the mitigation methods, and that'll be really useful for us to feed into this next phase of the project. So just to sum up, I hope I haven't gone over time, but basically we know shark depredation is a massive issue across the whole of Northern Australia, affecting a range of ecological and socioeconomic outcomes. The mitigation methods that fishers are currently using only have pretty limited benefit. We need to manage the need to reduce depredation whilst alongside conserving and protecting some of our threatened shark species, so promoting coexistence. And we think that education and technological solutions have a big role to play here based on the information I've shown you. And yeah, take part in the online survey. We want to really hear about the impacts depredation is having on your fishing and what you think is going to be suitable for mitigation. And yeah, ultimately, the next goal of this work is to really get out in the water with as many fishers as possible and do this large-scale testing of the mitigation methods. So thanks to you all for listening, and yeah, thanks Adam again for having me on. It's been great to meet you all, and just acknowledging some of our funding bodies here, so FRDC for the work we're currently doing, as well as Parks Australia for the projects at Lord Howe Island and Cocos Keeling Islands. And yeah, all the fishers and other stakeholders who took part in those workshops. That was a really valuable exercise. So happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much for a very professional presentation. And I'd like to offer everyone the opportunity to ask a question. So by all means, let's have a go, and then after you've asked your question, someone else, and if there's time you can ask another question next. So I think David, you're up first, is that right?
Yes. I'll just how does the fish tech work? Does that have a battery to provide power, and what are the approximate costs of that fish tech?
Yeah, it does. So it's an electrical device that has like a small pill battery inside. And it has a saltwater switch, so as soon as you put it in the water, it activates. And the battery life of that current prototype is about 60 hours. But they are working on a couple of other prototypes. So that one that I showed you was mainly designed for longline fisheries. So they were trying to make it really cost effective. They were aiming for about $20 per unit. But there's a new recreational, yeah, pretty cheap. But whether that's going to be, as I said, it's still in prototype phase. It's not on the market yet. And they're also working on a recreational device that's going to be more expensive, but that's going to be, that kind of works in a bit of a different way. So the goal for that one is that you clip it onto the line and send it down once a fish is hooked, rather than having it on there the whole time. And the idea behind that is so that you have a lower risk of actually losing the device, because obviously if you've got something on your gear close to the hook, there's a chance that you could get it snagged on the bottom, or, you know, a fish might bite through the line like a mackerel. So the idea behind that new recreational device is by, you know, just clipping it on and sliding it down once you've got the fish hooked, is, you know, reduces the risk of that. And also, you know, reduces the battery time that's being used as well. You know, it might only be in the water for 30 seconds rather than just being sitting down there for hours. So you don't have to replace the batteries as often. But yeah, no, it's a pretty promising prototype, and a lot of the fishers we spoke to were quite keen to get out and test it. So
keep your eyes out open for it. Thanks.
no worries.
Oh, other questions, just jump in. You can also use the chat function if you like as well.
I'm not a big fisher, but seeing the industry here in North Queensland, is there obviously the cost to professional bodies taking out numbers of people is really up there. Is there any scope for one or more of these devices becoming almost compulsory for professional bodies to actually take them on, so that cost to the industry and to the, I guess, the tourism industry and those broader community bodies aren't impacted as much?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and it's something we've thought about. So I guess there's a parallel here in terms of the like shark bite risk space. So in WA, they've got a subsidy scheme for shark deterrents to, you know, allow people to get them more cheaply and use them as like an individual safety device. So yeah, it puts the emphasis on the individual to use it and take responsibility. And I think the scope to do a similar thing with the deterrents for fishing as well. You know, once we've tested them thoroughly and assessed that they're effective, that could be a scheme that we could adopt. I think, as I mentioned, like these deterrents are, you know, you see them as tools for a certain job. They're not going to be suitable for all types of fishing. So I think making them compulsory might be challenging because there's certain circumstances where, you know, just not fully practical to use. But definitely, you know, trying to promote the uptake of them is a big one that we're going to be working on, because, you know, they're not a silver bullet, but if we can at least reduce depredation by, you know, 30 or 50%, then that's still a substantial cost saving for charter operators. And also from a sustainability point of view, it's a lot less fish dying. So that's beneficial for stocks. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in that space.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. First, thank you to share all this information. I love the presentation. And I would like to know what you think is the best approach to start a research in a new area where we don't have any data yet.
Yeah, thank you, Juliana. Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think this is something we thought about pretty carefully at the start of my PhD in Western Australia. You know, we're in the same position. We didn't have any data. It's hard to know where to start. But I think ultimately we started off with the boat ramp surveys because they're a really good way of collecting data when it's fresh in people's minds. So they've just come back from their fishing trip. They've just, you know, experienced the depredation. They can remember what happened on that trip. There are other ways that you can collect data in recreational fisheries, like a phone survey or an app. Sometimes they're a bit more challenging because it's harder for fishers to recall what happened in the past. So that would be one recommendation, to try and, you know, if there is a big recreational fishery in your area, that would be one way to start. But then from a commercial point of view, obviously it's really important to get that data as well. So trying to introduce some sort of really simple system to collect that depredation data, whether it's a logbook or, you know, using some sort of data collection method that the fishers are already used to, is beneficial. And keeping it as simple as possible, because often it's just really challenging and time consuming for them to collect that data when they're busy doing other things. So trying to make it as straightforward as possible, even if it's just one or two, you know, questions or fields like, did you experience depredation today? How many fish did you lose? just those two questions offer, provide really valuable information. And then also trying to work with other sort of groups and cooperatives who manage the fishery as well, because sometimes, if it's a fisheries agency or a university trying to come in and collect some data, there can often be, barriers to that. Sometimes the fishers don't necessarily understand why you're collecting that data, or they don't trust it. So I think trying to build up that relationship with the fishers first is really important, and making sure that you're, really taking their views on board and giving them a chance to share their experiences and identify some solutions as well, because ultimately, like, everyone knows the depredation is happening. So sometimes, people question, why are we just collecting data? Why aren't we immediately going out and testing mitigation methods? So trying to have some good information about how that data will be used for things like stock assessments is really important as well. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you.
Hello, Jonathan. I want to say thank you about the chat. It's really interesting and have this point of view about charts from the fisherman. And I wonder about if you know any possible impacts that these artifacts of these deterrents has on the sharks population. And what do you think about if we as a biologist have more information about the biology stocks or from the fishermen also, if we reduce that information, how we can get the status of their population in another way? Can we get that balance between knowledge and affecting the commercial of these activities?
Yeah, no, that's a really important balance, because I think obviously, like, a lot of things we're hearing around shark populations in Australia is that they're increasing, which is kind of goes against most of what we hear in terms of global populations. Like, we know in a lot of places around the world, shark populations are declining. So trying to actually collect that information on a local scale is really important. So with sharks, one of the difficulties with using data from commercial fisheries is species identification. So there's a lot of species that look pretty similar, and we don't always have good data on which species is being caught. It might just be grouped together at like a, carcharodonid sharks kind of level. So that's not very useful for stock assessments. So one of the key things is really making sure that fishers are trained in species ID. That's something we've been doing in Queensland over the last 5 to 10 years, trying to bring in better species ID guides, and with the actual logbook that they fill in, having fields for each individual species. And then on top of that, just trying to use other techniques as well. So the commercial landings data is one source of assessing populations, but we're looking into other genetic methods. So there's one called close kin mark recapture, which has been used now for a few shark species like white sharks, school sharks, and some of the river sharks as well. And that's quite a clever method, because it basically looks at the relatedness between individuals and comes up with an estimate of the overall population size. So it doesn't rely on having fisheries data just based on genetic samples. So that's quite a powerful technique that we're looking at to use, instead of fisheries dependent methods. But I think, fishers do have a really important role to play in terms of collecting data as well. So one of the data sources in other places is using records from things like game fishing competitions, where people actually go out and target sharks. Some of these fishing clubs have data going back like 50 years about the species they've been catching and how frequently. So that can be like a really useful source of data about what species they've encountered and whether there's been any change over time in that as well. Hopefully that addressed your question. There's a bit in there, but
Yes, thank you so
Uh,
much.
Yep.
Jonathan, Tony Fonts here from the Whit Sundays. Thanks for that presentation. That was fabulous. Your experience is not just local, it's worldwide, and it's really interesting. Just following
Thank
on
you.
with the population discussion you just had, and focusing just on the Great Barrier Reef, your mitigation method suggestions I was pleased to see pretty much focus on everything except shark culling, which unfortunately you did suggest that some of the fisheries, whether it's WA or New South Wales or Queensland, would be considering just that. Looking at the Great Barrier Reef and the condition of the reef and climate change, et cetera, and the importance of the sharks, do you see that that might actually occur within the Great Barrier Reef, or do you think that we'll be able to deal with it purely through the deterrence and education that you've been researching?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to try and find a balance. So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, anecdotally, we think that some of the shark populations have been recovering in Queensland due to that decline in commercial landings. But as I said earlier in the talk, I think trying to increase commercial landings of sharks isn't going to be a single solution either, because there are so many complexities to it. The market for it isn't great. You know, I don't think, culling in itself is going to be a strategy, but it's more about whether there's increased commercial landings. But even that, there's a lot of challenges. So as you know, like gill nets are being phased out in the GBR by 2027. So trying to catch sharks using line methods is, pretty challenging. It's not going to be as economically viable. You're still going to have issues with bycatch. Just catching the species you want without catching other species is really challenging. So I think, using that as a strategy is pretty limited in its validity. So that's why we're pushing more towards education and technological solutions, because we think they've got a lot more promise. From a sort of Queensland government perspective, obviously the goal of the government is to support commercial fisheries, whether it be sharks or any other species. But there's conversations happening in terms of looking into the management of those fisheries. But at this stage, in terms of this project that we're working on, we're mainly focusing on technological and education solutions.
Thank you.
Just to add to Tony's question, I think recreational fishers do have bag limits and size limits for sharks in Queensland waters, and that has been one of the big barriers to stop recreational fishers taking or killing the large shark. I think the size limit is 1.5 meters, and most of the big bull sharks that are involved in depredation are way bigger than that, so they can't be taken.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Thanks,
So there's a number of regulations like that for recreational fishers, and the commercial fishers also have other regulations, and that's changed a fair bit over the last 10 to 15 years, which is also playing into that decline in landings that I was mentioning.
Jonathan, just if I can ask another question. I'm predominantly in education, and the QCAA and the Queensland Studies Authority have this year rolled out a whole new lot of studies in practice. So in all of the curriculum areas, the science subjects for aquaculture and marine studies would have an area to focus on this in practical studies for the students. Is there a scope for educational resources for students to actually look at these studies that you've undertaken, as noted on a global scale, but also for data to be collected here off the coast from practical experiences for them?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So some of the places we've been working, so Cocos Keeling Islands, Adam and I went to the school there and gave a talk, mainly just about general shark biology, tailored depending on the age of the kids involved. But depredation is obviously a big one that they've heard a lot about from their parents already. So I think there's big scope there to try and incorporate that kind of approach. We could certainly put together, we've already got some material from that work we did at Cocos, but also putting together more information about just general facts around sharks and depredation as well. I think that would be a good approach, because often, the children are going out fishing with their parents, they're experiencing it firsthand. So I think trying to get some broad information out there about the research and about what can be done to reduce depredation is pretty valuable. So yeah,
nice.
happy to keep in touch and discuss that further.
Excellent. Thanks.
Anyone who hasn't asked a question now, who would like to ask a question before we ask people to ask a second question?
Sorry.
Okay, the floor's open. I see Dave's on the line as well from WA. Dave, do you want to just give us a bit of an update on how things have been going with you from a manufacturing perspective and an uptake of Repellex and so forth?
Thanks, guys. Yeah, great presentation there, John. Thank you. Since the COCUS study that was done in March this year with Parks and you guys, there's a few things that we've been working on. One of the things has been trying to make the product more affordable. So we've been trying to get the manufacturing costs down. We do manufacture in Australia, and that's quite challenging as far as keeping the costs down. But we have managed to reduce that by 10%. We've also had the issue is a lot of retail stores are wanting to stock it. So there needs to be enough, margin in there for the retailers to actually be able to support the price. So they've sort of wanted to hold the price up, rather than, reduce it. I have been away with University of Hawaii studying just recently, like last month I was on the big island of Hawaii, studying with the pelagics and deep dropping for predominantly yellowfin tuna and what else was just yellowfin tuna was a target species. Unfortunately, we didn't get the numbers that we needed to. There just wasn't enough data there with that study. We did get some, and we did use the trolling method, which, as John said, we clip it on the line and send it down the line. That's a new method that we've been trialing for the last 6 months, and it's been very effective. So it's basically just getting the standard, the Repellex, which is already on the market now. We provide it with a new great big snap-on clip, and you snap this on the line as soon as you've hooked your fish, either deep dropping or on the troll. You send this down the line, it goes around your, whatever target species, whether it's marlin, mackerel, tuna, Spanish mackerel, predominantly in WA, and this slides down around your fish. It reduces the fight of the fish, so the mackerel and the sailfish or the other pelagics don't fight so hard, so it's much easier to get them into the boat. But with this, we've found even more reduction in depredation, a very significant reduction in depredation from sharks. So that has been an update on that. We've also updated the product as well. It now runs for 2 hours. This is a new model which was only released in July this year. And this model here now runs for 2 hours, and it has a blinking light. So it's a little bit more user-friendly. And so once it gets to the last 30 minutes, it actually flashes, so you know that your battery time's running out. It still only goes to a depth of 120 meters, which is slightly bigger than what it originally was. And that's pretty much it as far as the updates for the system. But look, we are really keen to get any solid data on this. So the more information we can get, and we're pushing to get this subsidised so it can be more affordable. Our other system for personal deterrence has been subsidised by the WA state government for the last 2.5 years. We're really happy with that, and we believe that once this can be added to the subsidy or supported by WA governments, it's going to be more affordable for recreational and commercial fishermen.
Thanks, Dave. I'll go from one Dave to another. Dave, I think you asked the first question, and you're obviously a very keen recreational fisher. I can see the rods in the background. As a result of listening to this presentation, what are you going to do differently on your next fishing trip, or are you going to invest in some of this technology?
I'm going to keep my eye out for the fish tech. Basically, my my system has been to just try and fish where nobody else goes, and travel further. Like I say, my spots are over 100 k's out now to keep away. I did have another question, and that was, I see in Jonathan, you said in Queensland for the commercial fishers, you're going to introduce a spot where they record their catches, where they can record shark depredation. Will that be the same for charter boats? Because charter boats locally here have expressed that they'd like to record that, but there's nowhere to record it at present. Will that be happening for the charter boats as well in the future?
Yeah, that's the plan. Yeah, this has been something that we've been working on for a while, trying to get rolled out across both charter and commercial sectors, making sure it's done in a consistent way. But yeah, definitely we're planning on doing it for charters as well. The main thing is, like I said, to make sure we can get robust data, not just for the trips where it does happen, but where it doesn't happen as well. So if it's just left blank, we need to know whether that's because there was no depredation or they just didn't fill in that field. So trying to just address those kind of technical challenges is one thing, but we're pretty close to starting to roll out data collection in probably the reef line fishery will be one of the first ones to get that for the commercial fishers in terms of the e-logbook, because that's they've got like a condition on their export approval around getting better data for discards and depredation and things like that. So that's something we really need to address pretty soon.
Well, I think everyone's had a really good knowledge exchange session. Jonathan, you're a very professional presenter. Oh, Kerry's got one more.
One more question. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Jonathan. This is actually from a spearfishing point of view. Can these devices, one or more of them, can be used on float lines? So once we've got our catch and we pop them onto the line and they're on our float, obviously, just as on a fishing line, spearfishermen will lose catch in the same way from having their fish trailing behind them. Can these devices be used for recreational spearfishing?
Potentially, I think, well, maybe Dave could say for the Repellex, but I think there's no reason why you couldn't for the fish tex. It's quite a small device. But I know, talking to some spearfishers in New South Wales, they've been using a few different types of, they're called float boats. So like it's a little floating thing that they put their catch in once they get back to the surface, so that it's not just, in the water. But I think, yeah, definitely potential for those devices to be connected to the float line. Just depends on, I guess, the size of the electrical field and how long that line is, and making sure that it's deployed in the right way, and obviously noting the limitations around battery life as well. But yeah, maybe Dave could comment on that if he has any ideas.
Yeah, so the Repellex system can actually be connected through this. So you're going to get 2 hours runtime on this, and yeah, you're welcome to. We can send one over for you for if you want to try one at like cost price. But this is the sharks are not going to push through this. I know the fish tech is a very small field, and it's mainly designed for fish to stop biting on the hook. This field, you can see on our new study that we did in Hawaii. We had a large Galapagos. We had three large Galapagos sharks trying to get a whole tuna. We left it in the water for quite a while. They did not push through that. You can see the field is very strong, and they could not push through that at all. And so we put it down again with a non-active one to make sure it wasn't just the look of the device, and they got the fish straight away. So guarantee that the fish are not going to bite this off your clip line. The shark.
Excellent. Thank you.
Well, once again, thanks everyone. I think it was a really good group of people, from scientists to fishers to conservationists to teachers to product developers.